You stop calling me, I stop expecting you.
The studio lights glared with intensity, reflecting off the polished glass desk that separated two men from very different worlds, yet bound together by an unexpected conversation. Millions were tuned in across continents, in churches, homes, and community centers. It was one of those rare global broadcasts where people didn't just watch for entertainment, but for answers. On one side sat Bishop T.D. the American preacher whose sermons had filled stadiums, whose books topped bestsellers, and whose voice carried authority across Christian communities worldwide. He leaned slightly forward, his calm, commanding presence steady under the cameras. Opposite him sat a man who, though far younger, had already carved his place in modern history. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, the soldier-turned-statesman whose defiance against Western powers and call for African self-determination had electrified the continent. For months his name had stirred debates, some calling him a liberator, others branding him a threat. But none could ignore him, and now these two figures sat face to face in a conversation no one had expected. The preacher of souls and the president of a rising African nation. The bishop's voice broke the silence. "Mr. President, Jakes," began slowly, his tone respectful yet probing, "I've listened to your words about Africa, about breaking chains, about independence, about refusing to bow to the powers that be, and I cannot deny your conviction is remarkable. But today I want to go deeper than politics. Tell me, what place does Christianity hold in the heart of your people and in the heart of Burkina Faso itself?" The air grew thick. The question hovered, not just in the studio, but in the minds of millions watching. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing something profound was about to be said. Traoré adjusted his microphone, his eyes not only meeting the bishop's, but piercing the lens of the camera as if he was speaking directly into the soul of every man and woman watching. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that pressed down on the entire room. "Bishop," he began slowly, "Christianity is not new to Africa. It did not arrive on the first missionary ships, nor was it born in the minds of colonizers. Long before outsiders came with their crosses and their flags, Africa knew the Creator. We prayed, we fasted, we worshipped, we lived in reverence to the Almighty. Faith is older than colonization. Spirituality has always been here." He paused, the silence amplifying the gravity of his words. "What was forced upon us," he continued, "was not pure faith. It was a version of religion wielded as a weapon. It was the Bible in one hand and the chains in the other. They said, 'Obey your masters,' while they stole our land, our gold, our people, and our dignity. They told us to look to heaven for salvation, while they built empires with our sweat here on earth." A murmur rippled through the live audience. Some nodded with visible agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The bishop leaned back, his fingers interlocked, as if weighing whether to speak or to let the storm unfold. Traoré's tone softened, but his message cut even deeper. "Do not mistake me, Bishop. I do not reject Christ. I embrace him fully. But I reject the version of Christianity that was corrupted by conquest and slavery. Jesus was never a colonizer. Jesus was never an oppressor. Jesus was a liberator. He stood with the poor. He walked with the outcasts. He defended the broken. That is the Christ we must reclaim." The words seemed to echo. Social media feeds erupted instantly. Hashtags appeared in real time. Faith and freedom. Traoré speaks. Christianity reclaimed. The broadcast wasn't even halfway through, and already it had become a global trending moment. Bishop Jakes finally leaned forward again, his brows furrowed. His tone was firm, yet gentle. "Mr. President, forgive me if I press further, but are you saying that Christianity, as it has been practiced for centuries, is false?" Traoré's gaze did not waver. His reply came with conviction sharpened, like steel. "I am saying this. Christianity without justice is incomplete. A Christianity that talks about heaven but ignores hunger on earth is not the gospel of Christ. A Christianity that tells the slave to obey but never calls the master to repentance. That is not the faith of Jesus. That is religion twisted for power. He let his words hang, then delivered the line that would be replayed across every platform within minutes. Africa does not only need political liberation, we need spiritual liberation. We must break the chains not just on our lands, but also in our minds. Because faith that does not free the oppressed is not faith, it is entertainment, and Africa has no more time for entertainment. The studio gasped, some clapped loudly, others remained frozen. Screens across the world lit up with reactions, some angry, some inspired, but no one indifferent. The bishop's eyes narrowed slightly, both cautious and intrigued. And to you personally, Mr. President, what is Christianity, if not what? The world has known it to be? Traoré leaned in closer, his voice calm yet thunderous in its clarity. Christianity is not about cathedrals filled with gold. It is not about preachers living in luxury while widows go hungry. Christianity is not an identity card or a label worn on Sunday morning. True Christianity is the power of love, the courage to speak truth, and the relentless pursuit of justice. If it does not lift the poor, if it does not break chains, if it does not defend the widow and the orphan, then it is not the Christianity of Christ. In the audience, some were visibly moved to tears. Others sat stiff, shaken by the bluntness of his challenge. Across Africa, WhatsApp groups buzzed, Twitter feeds flooded, YouTube clips were already being uploaded. The conversation had lit a wildfire, and yet Traoré wasn't finished. His voice rose, his hand tapping the desk rhythmically as if marking each point into eternity. The Bible says in Exodus, God freed the children of Israel from Pharaoh's hand. That is not just history. It is a living prophecy for oppressed people everywhere. We are not waiting for another Moses. We must be our own Moses. We must believe that prayer without justice is empty, that faith without action is powerless. If we truly love God, then we must stand against every Pharaoh of our time, whether it wears a crown, sits in a palace, or hides inside global systems that exploit us. The bishop sat silent, absorbing each word. His lips pressed together, his eyes heavy with thought. He had preached about freedom for decades, about empowerment and breaking barriers. But here, in front of him, was a young African president speaking with the voice of a prophet, shaking the dust off the gospel, and daring the world to listen again. And that was just the beginning. The cameras didn't cut away. The silence was too powerful. Viewers around the world leaned closer, as if afraid to miss a single breath of what was happening. For many, it felt less like an interview and more like a confrontation between two worlds. One rooted in centuries of polished tradition and another rising from the raw earth of Africa, demanding to be heard. Bishop Jakes finally exhaled slowly, breaking the silence. His voice carried both curiosity and a subtle weight of caution. Mr. President, what you are saying, it challenges the very foundation of how many Christians around the world have understood their faith. Do you not fear that these words will provoke anger? Not just among politicians, but among churches, pastors, even the ordinary believers who see their faith differently? Traoré's lips curved slightly, not in arrogance, but in quiet defiance. His response was measured, as if each word had been weighed on the scales of conviction. Bishop, he began, his tone deliberate, truth has always provoked anger. Jesus himself was rejected not because he was silent, but because he spoke the truth that exposed lies. He overturned tables. He called out hypocrisy. He stood with the despised when the powerful demanded silence. If we claim to follow him, then why should we be afraid of the world's anger? Shouldn't we instead be afraid of his disappointment? The room shifted. Some in the audience clapped hesitantly, then louder, until the sound filled the studio. Cameras panned to faces wet with tears, others deep in thought. The bishop's eyes locked on Traoré, as though realizing he wasn't merely conversing with a politician. He was listening to a man who carried the cadence of a prophet. Ibrahim. President leaned forward, his voice softer now, intimate, like a father speaking to his children. I will tell you something, Bishop. In my country, people don't come to church because of doctrine debates. They come because they are desperate for hope. A mother who cannot feed her children, a farmer whose land has been stolen, a young man who sees no future. They enter church because they are hungry, not just for bread, but for meaning. But what happens? They tithe, they pray, they sing, and then they leave still hungry. The church buys louder microphones, brighter lights, newer chairs, while the widow, the orphan, the sick remain in pain. Tell me, Bishop, is this the Christianity of Christ? The words cut through the air like a blade. Even the bishop could not immediately reply. His hands clasped together tightly on the table, his eyes reflecting both discomfort and respect. Traoré continued, his voice gaining strength. Christianity must be measured not by the size of the church building, but by the size of its compassion. Not by how many sing on Sunday, but by how many children eat on Monday. If our churches are full of noise but empty of justice, then they are nothing but theaters of religion, and Africa cannot afford theater anymore. We need truth. We need transformation. We need a gospel that lives outside the walls of cathedrals. Around the world, people erupted online, Facebook threads filled with debates, WhatsApp groups buzzed with voice notes. Some pastors condemned the president already, calling his words dangerous, radical, even heretical. Others hailed him as a modern-day prophet, daring to call Christianity back to its roots. The bishop finally leaned in again, his voice quieter, almost reflective. Mr. President, you speak as though the gospel itself has been hijacked. Traoré's eyes flashed. It has, Bishop. For centuries the cross has been twisted into a tool of control. They taught us to bow while they built empires. They taught us submission, but never liberation. Yet the true Christ said, I came to set the captives free. That is the Jesus I believe in. That is the faith Africa must reclaim. His voice deepened, carrying the weight of history itself. And let me tell you this, the chains of colonialism did not end when the flags came down. They remained in the pulpits, in the systems, in the very way faith was taught to us. They told us Christianity was obedience without justice, prayer without power, heaven without dignity on earth. No more, Bishop, no more. Africa is awake, and this awakening is not only political, it is spiritual. The audience roared with applause, some rising to their feet. The bishop let the sound wash over the studio before raising his hand gently, for calm. But Mr. President, he said softly, you are speaking of transformation that goes beyond church walls. How do you see faith shaping the future of your nation, of Africa itself? Traoré's voice steadied again, low but fierce. Faith is not meant to be locked in temples. Faith is meant to build roads, to heal the sick, to lift the poor, to protect the farmer, to educate the child. If our faith is not doing these things, then it is not faith. It is a costume. True Christianity must be lived out in every marketplace, in every farm, in every school, in every government office. That is the Christianity I stand for. He paused, then delivered another line that rippled across the airwaves. If your preaching does not liberate the African child from hunger, if your church does not defend the African farmer whose land is stolen, if your prayers do not protect the African mother dying in childbirth because hospitals lack medicine, then your Christianity is not Christ. It is performance. And Africa has no more time for performances. Gasps filled the studio. Some applauded fiercely, others sat in silence, but everyone was moved. The bishop closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the force of the truth. When he opened them again, his voice was low, almost trembling. You speak of justice, Mr. President, but justice is costly. Are you ready for the resistance, the criticism, the rejection that will surely come? Traoré leaned back, his expression unshaken. Bishop, freedom has always been costly. Liberation has always come with scars. But I would rather face rejection for standing with Christ than applause for serving oppression. My people deserve a faith that frees them, not one that chains them. If this truth cost me everything, so be it. Better to lose with truth than win with lies. The room fell silent again. The bishop slowly nodded, his face heavy with thought. For decades he had preached empowerment and liberation, But here was a young African president speaking with the fire of a prophet and the clarity of a reformer. It wasn't a debate, it was a revelation. And as the broadcast continued, one thing became undeniable. This was not just a conversation between two men. It was a turning point in how Africa, and perhaps the world, would begin to see faith. The broadcast resumed after a short break. But in truth, no one had taken a break. Across the continent of Africa, televisions stayed tuned, radios crackled, mobile phones streamed live. WhatsApp groups had exploded with messages, churches were already calling emergency meetings, and universities whispered about what this moment might mean. The scene on stage was deceptively simple. Two men seated across from one another. But to millions watching, it felt like the stage of history itself. One man represented the global church with decades of preaching, influence, and authority. The other, a soldier-turned-president, embodied the raw hunger of a continent rising to its feet, demanding both justice and faith. The bishop leaned forward, breaking the silence with a voice that carried both caution and compassion. "Mr. President, you speak with passion that moves the heart. Yet, I must ask, when you speak of reclaiming Christianity for Africa, are you not afraid of dividing the global church? Christ prayed for unity. Are we not risking disunity when we speak in such radical terms?" The president inhaled deeply, his eyes fixed on the camera as though addressing the world, not just the bishop. "Unity without truth, Bishop, is nothing but slavery. If unity means silence in the face of injustice, then it is not unity, it is complicity. Jesus himself said, 'I came not to bring peace, but a sword.' What did he mean? He meant truth divides lies from justice, freedom from oppression. So, I ask you, Bishop, what kind of unity do we seek? The unity of Pharaoh and the slave, or the unity of Moses and his people walking to freedom?" The crowd erupted. Some clapped thunderously, while others sat still, stunned. Hashtags lit up Twitter. "Your unity with justice. Here's Africa awakens. Faith and freedom." The bishop took a slow breath, visibly shaken but unwilling to retreat. "You speak as though Africa has been abandoned by the church. And yet I know missionaries, I know organizations, I know pastors who have given their lives for Africa. Are you dismissing their sacrifices?" The president shook his head slowly, his tone heavy but respectful. "No, Bishop. I honor those who came with true love, with pure intentions. But let us not confuse individuals with systems. The missionary who fed the hungry is not the same as the empire that shipped our ancestors across the ocean in chains. The preacher who built a school is not the same as the colonizer who stole our gold. The faith of Christ is not the same as the religion of conquest. And that is the distinction Africa must see clearly. We are not rejecting Christ. We are rejecting the chains that were disguised in his name." The bishop leaned back, silent, as if letting those words sink into every corner of the studio. Traoré pressed forward, his hand striking the table softly for emphasis. "Let me tell you something. Bishop, in my land, when the drums beat, the people dance. But when the church bells ring too often, the people only kneel. They kneel, they weep, they tithe, but after the service ends, they return to their poverty, their hunger, their despair. Meanwhile, the preacher drives home in luxury. This is not Christianity, it is business. And I say to Africa, enough." Gasps filled the studio. Cameras zoomed in on audience members, some nodding fiercely, others whispering nervously. Online, debates grew louder. Some called him blasphemous. Others hailed him as the new voice of truth. The bishop finally raised his hand. "Mr. President, I cannot deny that your words carry truth. But tell me this. If you strip away the false religion, what remains? What is Christianity to you? Define it, not in what it is not, but in what it must be." The president paused, his face solemn. He adjusted his microphone, leaned closer, and his voice dropped to a tone so steady it silenced the audience completely. "Christianity is not about cathedrals. It is not about titles. It is not about choirs or cameras. Christianity is about love that is stronger than hate, truth that is louder than lies, and justice that refuses to bow. Christianity is the widow who shares her last meal with a hungry child. It is the farmer who forgives the neighbor that wronged him. It is the leader who refuses to steal from his people, even when he has the power to do so. Christianity is Christ. Nothing more, nothing less. The words hit like thunder. The bishop closed his eyes, whispering something under his breath that microphones did not catch. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a confession, but the president wasn't finished. Let me ask you, Bishop, and through you I ask every preacher watching this broadcast, if Jesus walked into your churches today, what would he see? Would he see his message alive, or would he see golden chairs, private jets, choirs singing while children outside go hungry? My fear is that he would overturn our offering baskets, just as he overturned the tables of the money changers. He would not applaud, he would weep. The audience fell into a heavy silence. Some wiped their eyes, others shook their heads as though confronted with an uncomfortable truth. The bishop finally spoke, his voice low, trembling slightly. You are holding a mirror to us, Mr. President, a mirror that is not easy to face. Traoré nodded firmly. Yes, Bishop, because Africa has no more time for games. The time for shallow religion is over. We need faith that liberates, faith that builds schools, that protects farmers, that heals the sick, that empowers women, that gives dignity to workers. Anything less is not Christianity, it is theater. And I refuse to let my people die in theaters of religion while their oppressors grow stronger. The crowd broke into thunderous applause again. The sound echoed across the stage, through television sets, into homes, churches, and even political offices around the world. Leaders were watching, pastors were watching, the young were watching, Africa was watching, and at that moment, it became clear that this conversation was no longer about one bishop and one president. It was about the very soul of faith in Africa and, perhaps, the soul of Christianity itself. The bishop sighed, almost visibly humbled. Mr. President, he said quietly, you are calling us back to something raw, something original. But I must warn you, revolutions, whether political or spiritual, are always met with fierce resistance. Are you prepared for the cost? Traoré's eyes blazed with determination. Bishop, I was a soldier before I became a president. I know what it means to risk everything. If standing for truth makes me an enemy, so be it. If calling for justice makes me a target, so be it. Better to fall fighting for freedom than to live chained in silence. And let me say this clearly. Africa will no longer kneel before false gods, whether they wear crowns, carry Bibles, or hold foreign power. We will kneel only before God and rise before men. The audience leapt to its feet. Applause, shouts, tears, even prayers filled the room. The cameras zoomed in on faces streaming with emotion. Online, the reaction was explosive. Some called it the African Reformation. Others called it dangerous. But all agreed on one thing. The world had just witnessed a moment that could not be forgotten. The bishop sat silently for a moment, then whispered, almost to himself, perhaps this is the revival we have been praying for. Not revival of lights and music, but revival of truth. The president nodded slowly. Yes, Bishop. Revival will not come from concerts or conferences. It will come when Christians begin to live, like Christ, feeding the hungry, freeing the oppressed, standing for justice. That is the fire Africa is waiting for. And when it begins, it will not stop in Africa. It will spread across the world. The broadcast feed caught the bishop's trembling hands clasped tightly together. For the first time in decades, perhaps, he seemed less like the preacher teaching and more like the student learning. And as the cameras captured the two men in silence, the world held its breath. Something historic was happening. Something irreversible. The African president had not only challenged the church, he had shaken the conscience of the world. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the broadcast entered its final stretch. Yet no one watching moved an inch. Not in the audience, not in the homes across Africa, not in the churches and conference halls around the world. People sat frozen, eyes fixed on the screen, ears tuned to every word, as if history itself had decided to unfold live before them. The bishop shifted in his chair. He had spent decades preaching to millions, leading conferences with presidents and kings in attendance. But this moment was different. He wasn't standing behind a pulpit with a crowd of worshipers hanging on his every word. He was sitting across from a soldier president half his age, who carried the weight of a restless continent on his shoulders. "Mr. President," the bishop began, his voice low and reflective, "you speak with fire, and I cannot deny the truth in much of what you say. But fire can also burn. Are you not afraid that this message of liberation, if misunderstood, will push people away from faith altogether?" The president leaned forward, his gaze unwavering, his words measured. "Bishop, faith that cannot stand the fire is no faith at all. Gold is refined by fire. Truth is tested by fire. And a faith that collapses when questioned was never faith. It was an illusion. If my words drive people away from illusions, then let them walk away. For only then will they be free to meet Christ himself." The bishop's eyes glistened, as though he had just heard something he had preached for years, but never fully grasped until that moment. The president continued, his voice rising with conviction. "I am not here to destroy Christianity. I am here to strip away the lies that have chained it. I am here to return it to Christ, the liberator, the healer, the truth-teller. Too long has Africa been told to wait for freedom in heaven while living in chains on earth. No, the God of heaven demands justice on earth too. The same Jesus who promised paradise also said, 'Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.' Why then do we build kingdoms for men and leave our people starving? Why do we speak of eternity but ignore the present? That, Bishop, is not faith, it is betrayal." The audience broke into loud applause, though not everyone clapped. Some sat still, their faces troubled, wrestling with the weight of his words. "The Bishop raised his hand, trying to steady the tide. "You are asking us to rethink everything, Mr. President. You are shaking the very pillars of what many of us have built. Do you realize the kind of storm this will cause? Churches will divide, preachers will rage, politicians will fear you, and even your allies may desert you." The president nodded slowly, almost with a faint smile. "Bishop, storms do not scare me. I was a soldier before I was a president. I have stood under fire. I have faced death. I have buried brothers in arms. What is a storm of words compared to that? If Christ himself was crucified for speaking truth, then why should I fear? If my people suffer in silence while I remain quiet, then I am no leader. I am a coward, and I refuse to be a coward." The crowd rose again, their applause echoing like thunder in the studio. Cameras panned to faces wet with tears, fists raised in solidarity, hearts clearly stirred. The bishop lowered his head, visibly humbled. "You remind me of the prophets of old," he said softly. "Men who spoke not to please kings or crowds, but to call nations back to God. Men who were hated, exiled, even killed for daring to say what others feared. And yet, their words lived longer than their enemies." Traoré's eyes glowed with quiet intensity. "Then let it be so, Bishop. If my words outlive me, then I have done my duty." Silence fell. Heavy, holy silence. Then, as though compelled, the bishop leaned forward and asked, "Tell me then, Mr. President, what is your vision? If Christianity must return to Christ, what does that look like for Africa, for your people, for the future?" The president drew a deep breath. His voice slowed, steady and deliberate, each word landing like a stone upon the water, sending ripples through every listener. "My vision is simple, Bishop. A faith that feeds the hungry before feeding the preacher. A faith that builds hospitals before building cathedrals. A faith that teaches the child to read before teaching the choir to sing. A faith that defends the widow before defending the wealth of leaders. A faith that is not about show, but about service. Not about power, but about sacrifice. Not about entertainment, but about truth. That is the Christianity Africa needs. That is the Christianity the world has forgotten." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And more than that, Bishop, My vision is of an Africa standing tall, unchained, self-reliant. An Africa whose faith is not borrowed, not bought, not dictated by foreign powers. An Africa where Christianity is not a tool of control, but a fountain of freedom. Where the gospel is not preached in words only, but lived in actions daily. That is the Africa I fight for. And that is the faith I will defend, even if it costs me everything. The studio erupted in thunderous applause, louder than anything before. People stood, some weeping, others shouting affirmations, many recording the moment on their phones, knowing they were witnessing history. The bishop, overwhelmed, rose to his feet. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand across the table. The president stood too, meeting him halfway, their hands clasped firmly. Two worlds, two generations, two visions colliding, and yet, in that moment, uniting. The cameras zoomed in on the handshake, knowing it would become an iconic image. A bishop and a soldier, a preacher and a president, bound together not by agreement on every point, but by a shared conviction that faith must return to its true essence. The bishop's voice trembled as he spoke. Mr. President, I came here, prepared to question you, perhaps even to correct you. But tonight you have reminded me, reminded all of us, of what we risk losing when faith becomes comfortable. You have awakened something that has long slept, and for that, I thank you. The president bowed his head slightly. And I thank you, Bishop, for listening. Many would have walked away. Many would have silenced me. But you gave me the stage. That itself is courage. The two men stood together as the studio audience applauded relentlessly. The host's voice cut in, shaky but trying to maintain composure. Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed what may be remembered as one of the most important conversations of our time. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and Bishop T.D. speaking not just to each other, but to the world. The broadcast's theme music began to play softly, but the applause did not stop. Social media exploded with millions of posts, clips, and hashtags. Faith and freedom, back to Christ, Africa awakens, reclaim Christianity. As the cameras slowly faded to black, the image of the two men standing hand in hand lingered. Not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, because in that moment something had shifted, not just in the studio, not just in Africa, but across the world. A new conversation had begun, one that could not be silenced, one that would ripple through churches, governments, families, and hearts. The bishop had spoken. The president had spoken. But above all, truth had spoken. And the world would never be the same.